Very good Friday morning to you. I'm Jim Sciutto. Poppy Harlow has the day off today. Happening now, President Biden steps out on the world stage at the G7 summit in England, arriving for his first day of that summit in his first foreign trip as commander-in-chief. In minutes, he is set to meet with global leaders of the world's top democracies, including taking that iconic family photo, as it's known, a symbolic moment for the president. We will bring you that moment live. But back here in the U.S., breaking overnight. Alarming news. The Trump administration accused of a gross abuse of power, weaponizing the Justice Department. Sources telling CNN that DOJ prosecutors looking to track down leaks seized records from more than 100 people, including those of two prominent Democratic lawmakers, along with their staff and their families, even seizing the electronic records of a child. A stunning use of the U.S. Justice Department. We're going to have more on that developing story in just a moment. Let's begin, though, with Jeff Zeleny, live from Falmouth, England. Jeff, after 4 years of President Trump's America First agenda, we saw that repeatedly cause some melodrama at events like this, even during the photo. A different tone, a different tack from President Biden. What do we expect to see today?
Jim, good morning. We all remember that well. President Trump arriving at these world summits and elbowing his way in quite literally in some of these photos. So we're going to see President Biden really in the next several minutes arriving at the summit site with other leaders of the G7. And of course, this is he's been making the claim that America is back. Now he has to prove it through these conversations, through these one-on-one meetings and these group meetings. There's much on the agenda here. But President Biden has cast this as a very serious, momentous time for the world as it recovers or tries to recover economically and otherwise from the global pandemic. He said it's every bit as important and monumental as the post-war period. And he indeed has been trying to draw that contrast, building up the transatlantic alliance. Of course, we saw him yesterday meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but he will be meeting with other leaders of the G7 here, and so much on their plate, including the economy, of course, the pandemic, and China, of course, not a member of the G7, not here, but certainly a subtext of all of the conversations going forward here. So we will see these leaders coming together for the first time, and it's really going to be an opportunity for President Biden, in some cases, to meet them for the first time. And the White House just announcing earlier this morning that German Chancellor Angela Merkel will be making her first visit to the White House next month for a one-on-one meeting. So, Jim, all of this is leading into, of course, a crescendo, if you will, that meeting next Wednesday in Geneva with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Jim.
That's right. We will be there live as well to cover that. Jeff Zeleny, thanks so much. Let's turn back to this breaking news this morning. Stunning new reporting shows how President Trump and the Justice Department secretly seized private records belonging to at least two Democratic lawmakers, both of whom were frequent targets of the president, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff and Congressman Eric Swalwell, along with their aides and family members, including at least one minor. In February 2018, the FBI subpoenaed Apple, seeking what's known as metadata on more than 100 accounts, the phone numbers dialed, etc. It was part of an effort to uncover details on who leaked news stories about contacts between Russia and associates of Trump. The New York Times was the first to report this story. Let's bring in CNN senior justice correspondent Evan Perez, as well as CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans. Evan, let's begin with you, if we can. Tell us, well, that's actually Renato Mariotti, but I believe we will have Evan Perez on this. Evan, are you there? There's Evan Perez.
I'm here, yeah.
The real Evan Perez. Tell us about, one, the scale of this, which is truly remarkable, 100 accounts, but also who specifically we know were the targets.
Yeah, Jim, look, this was what you're looking at is essentially Donald Trump's enemies list from that era, 2018, 2017, 2018. He was obsessed with anything having to do with the Russia investigations. And Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell were two of the people that were on television a lot talking about the investigation that was being done by that committee, the Intelligence Committee. And the scale that you're talking about is extraordinary. We're talking about over 100 accounts, and again, not 100 people, but over 100 accounts, and it's an extraordinary dragnet to bring in family members, to staff members, current and former staff members, according to the people we've been talking to. And it appears that just like they approached the media leak investigations, the ones that targeted the Washington Post reporters from the New York Times and Barbara Starr from CNN, there was a gag order placed, so that prevented Apple from being able to notify the customers, in this case members of Congress, that the Justice Department had obtained their data until very recently. In May is when they first were notified by Apple after the expiration of that of the gag order. The scale again is extraordinary. Adam Schiff, one of the members who was targeted here, talks about that scale. Listen.
I can't go into who received these subpoenas or whose records were sought. I can't say that it was extraordinarily broad. People having nothing to do with the intelligence matters that are at least being reported on. It just shows what a broad fishing expedition it was.
And Jim, just to button this up, it begins in February 2018. The gag order was renewed 3 times. And curiously enough, this all comes to an end just days before Joe Biden becomes president. That's when it appears, according to the records and according to our sources, that the Justice Department just loses interest in this.
Evan Perez, thanks very much. Christine, the role of Apple here. Yeah. Notable. I mean, Apple has this metadata, and sure, they also had to abide by this gag order. I mean, does a company like Apple have a choice when subpoenaed like this?
It was a grand jury subpoena to Apple in early 2018, and Apple says it abides by the law. Look, this happens all the time, by the way. I mean, when you look at the numbers, in the first half of 2020, every 6 months, Apple reveals these numbers. There were 5,800 requests by the U.S. government for access to accounts, and Apple approved about 87% of those. When you look at their requests, the government requests for access to actual physical devices, your phone, there's even more of those. So Apple has a whole system for navigating this, and this is what Apple says. Apple carefully reviews all legal requests to ensure there's a valid legal basis for each request and complies with legally valid requests. In certain cases, they may object, challenge, or reject the request, but as I said, in terms of those accounts, some 87% of the time in the first 6 months of 2020, they did grant them. But they couldn't talk about it, right? There were these 3 different gag order, the gag order that was renewed 3 times, so they couldn't talk about it. So the people who are targets of this are just learning about this now. And you might recall back in 2015, remember when Apple famously wouldn't crack open the iPhone of the San Bernardino shooter, one of those shooters? They didn't want to devise some sort of code, some backdoor to get into phones, because that could be a dangerous precedent. That's a little different than abiding by a judge here essentially and giving this metadata. Some of this data, by the way, is encrypted anyway, so it's unclear what exactly the government could see.
I did think, Christine, before you said it, of that case with the San Bernardino shooter. And Apple put up a huge fight. I think eventually the EPA got in, I think, using a hacker, so they didn't need Apple's help. But remarkable contradiction there. Evan Perez, Christine Romans, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
To help break all of this down, I'm joined now by former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti, as well as CNN Early Start co-anchor Laura Jarrett. So, Renato, administrations have investigated leaks before. The Obama administration did, and they've sought records of reporters before. The scale of this, however, 100 accounts and 2 Democratic lawmakers, very much public targets of this president. Tell us what is unique about this case and what's a step beyond, if so, in your view.
Well, first of all, as Adam Schiff mentioned a moment ago that you played, the sheer scale of this is really something. It shows an extraordinary amount of effort. I mean, 100-plus subpoenas sent out. That's a very, very wide-ranging investigation over a matter that you have to wonder whether it would ever result in charges. You know, there was some reporting by the New York Times regarding this, suggesting that people within the Justice Department at the time, even in the Trump administration, were questioning whether they could ever bring a case related to this. And you could imagine if any associate of Adam Schiff or Eric Swalwell was put on trial, they would have a very good defense. A jury would have a lot of trouble believing this. So it really does look politically motivated, like the use of the Justice Department for political purposes.
Laura Jarrett, to Renato's point, it's the Times reporting that this started under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, didn't really go anywhere, but it was resurrected under Bill Barr, a special prosecutor brought from somewhere else assigned to this case. And Barr would have had to approve, according to our colleague Ellie Honig, the gag order as well. Tell us about his personal involvement here. Why? What do we know?
Well, remember the context here, Jim. I was covering the Justice Department at the time. You were breaking stories left and right on the Russia investigation. Remember how tense it was for Sessions in particular, because he recuses himself from the Russia investigation. Trump is furious because now his handpicked attorney general can't protect him anymore. He's furious about the stories that are coming out on a daily basis. He's calling out on Twitter for really the DOJ and the FBI to investigate what he called the leakers on a daily basis. So we wonder how much the Justice Department had to get instruction from the White House. Well, he was calling for it on Twitter for the public to see at the time. But then the case goes cold. And at least from the Times reporting, it appears that they really didn't find anything. Now, of course, they're not getting the actual communications. Remember, they're getting what's known as the metadata. So they're getting just the underlying information on dates and email addresses. They're not getting the actual emails between two people. But it was enough that they kept going for at least a certain amount of time. And then when Attorney General Bill Barr comes in after Sessions gets fired, then somehow the case is revived. But it's not revived in the normal way. Usually career prosecutors handle this thing. But under Barr, he has a hand-picked man from the the U.S. attorney in New Jersey, a person who, by all accounts, has no experience in national security. He's the one he picks to charge, to actually investigate this further. And so I think that's part of why people are pausing on this to say this doesn't look good. It looks like the Justice Department wielding its power against a co-equal branch of government.
Okay, so Renato, beyond not looking good, what are the legal implications here? Eric Swalwell, one of the Democratic lawmakers targeted, he says, in his view, that he believes they were targeted punitively. We know that staff members were targeted as well, including staff members who were not involved in the Russia probe. And we know that at least one of those accounts accessed was that of a minor. Are there legal implications here, legal recourse for those involved?
You know, it's difficult for me to see. I mean, it's unclear, you know, what, as Laura just mentioned a moment ago, it's not like their communications were obtained. I will say that this is sent out by prosecutors. Prosecutors can obtain your metadata, your records regarding, let's say, who you made a phone call to, for example, just by shooting a subpoena out. And it's something that requires no approval. When I was a prosecutor, I used to just ask my secretary to draft it up. So, you know, there could be, Congress could place limits on their authority if they wanted to.
That's notable, right? It's not like a warrant where you would need a judge to approve it. You're saying that the prosecutors, to be clear, could send out the subpoena themselves.
Exactly right.
Was involved, right? We know, but we do know a grand jury. I think the Times is reporting a grand jury was involved. So there has to be, Renato knows this better than I do, but there has to be some predication. They must have had some reason to believe that there would be probable cause that they would have evidence of a crime, right?
It's actually below it's below probable cause for issuing the subpoena. So to charge, they would need probable cause, but they need even a lower standard than that. As a practical matter, as long as the prosecutor thinks it's going to lead to evidence, they can issue the subpoena. That's why these subpoenas are pretty wide-ranging, and they were able to get away with it.
Understood. Okay, important clarification there. We should note metadata means, as you said, Renato, numbers called, who called whom, that kind of thing, not the content of those conversations. Renato Mariotti, Lara Jarrett, thanks so much.
Sure.
Still to come this hour, much more on this story. We're going to speak with Congressman Eric Swalwell, one of those two Democratic lawmakers targeted by Trump's Justice Department with these subpoenas. And does President Biden's infrastructure bill still have a chance? There is a new bipartisan framework agreement. That's a step forward because it's actually some details, some meat on the bone. How much hope? Next, I'm going to speak with the Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director on the National Security Council about President Biden's critical test at his first G7 summit. Coming up, his meeting with Putin.
CNN Newsroom.
So, you know, there are general agreements on the sort of endpoints of some of these goals, whether it's NATO, whether it's vaccine rollout, but there are differences in between. But again, I'll come back to that point. The relationship that President Macron tried to have and tried to establish with President Trump, how is he going to manage this relationship with President Biden? No doubt through the same effort at charm and warmth and trying to persuade him of his view.
Yeah, le bromance, as it was known, was not meant to be between Macron and Trump. We'll see how the relationship is between Macron and Biden. We will bring you that family photo, as it's known, when it comes. We're told that after these individual photos we've just seen, the group will get together for that sign of unity. But until that moment, joining me now is Amanda Sloat. She's Special Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Europe on the National Security Council. Amanda, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Thank you.
I want to begin with what Biden's overall message is here in his first overseas trip. We've heard the phrase repeated many times, America is back, the U.S. is back. That is a new message meant to be a direct contrast between America and the world under Trump. But I wonder, beyond the message, what is the new policy or strategy? Because there are real threats to the U.S. and its European allies, Russia among them, and there are real divisions. So what's the substance behind that message?
Absolutely. I think not only is America back, but back to rally the world's democracies and back from a position of strength, given all of the investments that the president has already made in the domestic economy and the pandemic recovery at home over the last number of months. You're absolutely right that there's a number of shared global challenges, but President Biden believes firmly that the United States is much stronger and more effective when it is dealing with our closest allies and partners. And so it's really no surprise that his first overseas trip is here to Europe, where he'll be meeting with the G7, the world's largest industries and democracies, to really rally them on vaccines, on climate change, on all of the pressing problems that we're facing, before heading to NATO, the world's strongest military alliance, and then to the EU, who is also our partner on all of these issues.
Okay. So that message is important. We know that U.S. allies, America's closest allies, were made very nervous by Trump's public pronouncements, his moves often targeting allies, for instance, with national security directives on trade, etc. But the fact is that even under Biden, granted it is early, Russian, for instance, aggression has not stopped. They're still attacking dissidents. They are still carrying out numerous cyber attacks against the U.S. So I'm curious, beyond the message, how will the Biden approach change, for instance, Russian behavior, aggression? What's going to be different?
Well, I think this is exactly part of the reason why President Biden wants to sit down and meet with President Putin. This is certainly not a reset. The president is very clear on that. This is not a reward. I think the president believes that there are areas where we can work with the Russians, for example, on things like strategic stability, which is important not only to the United States, but also to our European allies. And at the same time, the president has made very clear that he is going to address our differences. And as we saw a number of months ago, when the United States rolled out various response options to things that we had seen the Russians do, including interference in our domestic elections, that there are going to be consequences for that. And I think the president really believes that he's going to have the wind at his back as he moves into this meeting with President Putin, following a series of meetings, not only with the G7, but especially NATO, which will be reasserting the continued defense and deterrence of the NATO alliance, as well as the EU and leaders here at the G7.
One moment, Amanda, as you've been speaking, the family photo of those G7 leaders taking place here. You might notice a socially distanced family photo for the age of the pandemic there. The leaders a few feet apart, but not wearing masks. This traditionally a sign of unity. They appear together because they want to show the world that they stand together. That said, there are some differences among that group. Amanda, the family photo is now done. I want to talk about threats to democracy in Europe, because that is a very big topic of conversation, not just among G7 allies, but NATO allies. We have a Russia that poisoned its main opposition leader and sent him to a penal colony. That's a fact. We have Belarus, Russia's neighbor, but also an ally, that hijacked a plane out of European skies and took a dissident off that plane. You have deliberate challenges to democracy and the rule of law. And that, like cyber attacks, has not been getting better from Russia. So I'm curious what substantively President Biden proposes to do to defend democracy if America is indeed back.
You're absolutely right about the threat of democracy. And I think one of the things that President Biden is most focused on and certainly has spoken most passionately about is what he believes as this existential challenge, this generational challenge that we are facing right now about this question between democracies and autocracies. And I think you asked earlier about his overarching message, and it really is that democracies can work and democracies can come together to address these challenges. There's going to be conversations with the leaders here at the G7 about ransomware. There's going to be conversations within NATO about cyber and what more NATO can do, both as an alliance institutionally and also among its member states, to ensure that it is not only postured to deal with some of the traditional threats, but also these new and emerging threats that we are seeing. There will be conversations here at the G7 about positive alternative options in terms of infrastructure. I think things that we are doing on the pandemic, conversations that will be happening on China and Russia at NATO. And so I think really these issues are going to cut across what the president is going to be doing here over the next couple of days, and really continue to make this message that when the world's democracies are unified, working together in very concrete and tangible ways, that we can prove to the American people and to people around the world that democracies are much more effective as a system of governance.
Before you go, one consistency between the Trump and Biden administrations is I don't want to say hostile, but a steadfast approach to China, right? That has not changed with the election. Biden is looking for unity from European allies in standing up to Chinese trade practices, but also its own attacks on democracy. What does the president expect to get from his European allies to show that he can unite them in a way that President Trump did not? Trump did it alone. Biden has said he's going to stand up to China with his allies. How?
I think there's going to be a lot of discussion here this weekend at the G7 among leaders about a positive alternative to China in terms of developing positive infrastructure models, health models, in terms of addressing the pandemic. There's also going to be conversations at NATO about what the alliance needs to do in terms of dealing with the strategic challenge from China. And similarly with our European allies, we're going to have a conversation about how we can continue to write the rules of the road together, particularly when it comes to trade and technology issues.
Amanda Sloat, Special Assistant to the President, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
And we will have more on our breaking news in just a moment. Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee will hold a briefing this afternoon to share more about what they've learned about the records seized by former President Trump's Justice Department. CNN has learned that in 2018, the DOJ subpoenaed Apple for metadata from the accounts of House intelligence Democrats, some 100 accounts, in fact, including staffers and others, part of an effort to uncover who the administration believed leaked news stories about contacts between Russia and Trump associates. Joining me now to discuss is one of those Democrats targeted, member of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. Congressman, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Good morning, Jim. Thank you.
So much still to learn here about the extent of it and who these other accounts belong to. But specific to you, knowing that you were one of the targets here, did Apple, as they informed you, tell you any dates of when this happened, what specific data, phone numbers were handed over, or who you were speaking with at the time? Did they tell you those specifics?
No, Jim. You can kind of glean that this was 2017, 2018 from some of the government court documents on the file, but no, there's very much that we don't know, much that we want to learn. And Jim, this isn't really about me or Chairman Schiff. This is about everyday Americans, who don't want to see their government weaponize law enforcement against them because of their political beliefs. And I hope Trump supporters who fear Big Brother see that Donald Trump was the biggest brother we've ever seen in our country, who did weaponize this to go all the way down the stack into, the private communications of people he perceived as political opponents.
This happened at a time, and CNN's reporting as well, that the Trump administration, the president himself, fixated on the investigation into his team's, his associates' contacts with Russians. And the president's public comments at the time, we know those. We know his focus and how upset it made him. Do we know what initially sparked this investigation under then Attorney General Sessions? Is it the president's interest, the president's focus there? Have you been told anything, or can you glean anything again from what was seized here?
That's what Chairman Schiff is asking, and I support. Inspector General report into just who ordered this, who went along with this, why it continued for so long when nothing was turned up what the president wanted. I'll tell you what we turned up in our House intelligence investigation that the president didn't like. We showed that the president sought help from Russia, benefited from help from Russia, planned on receiving help from Russia, and as president governed as somebody who put Russia ahead of the United States. We proved that. But the allegations that there were leakers on the Intelligence Committee, this case is closed, and he certainly didn't prove it, other than that he was willing to abuse power to try and smear an opponent.
Well, let me ask you that directly. Did you at any time leak any classified information regarding that or other investigations?
No, never.
Okay. Asked and answered. We know that two members of the Intelligence Committee so far, you and Intel Chairman Adam Schiff, they were targeted. Have you learned of any more members who were targeted since last night, or the extent of what staffers were targeted here? Because I've been told that it wasn't just staff for the Intel Committee or even staff that was working on the Russia investigation, but that the records seized went even beyond that.
Jim, as far as I know, it was Chairman Schiff and myself. I wouldn't be surprised if there were other members, but that's why Chairman Schiff's call for an investigation is so important.
Understood. What is your view of how the Department of Justice under the current Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has handled this so far? I mean, a simple, basic question is, what have they told you since you've discovered this? Have you been satisfied with their answers?
We haven't heard anything yet, and there are a lot of questions we have and answers that we expect. And Jim, this is unacceptable. Anyone who was involved in this should be fired and walked out of the department immediately. Because, Jim, look, this is not a 500-year flood. Donald Trump is not going away. His Trumpism and corruption manifests itself and others in government right now. And next time they may not, be so patient to wait for an investigation. A more corrupt president may just cut to the chase and lock up his or her political opponents without trying to have the Department of Justice do it. So that's why we should make it very clear that we don't do this in this country. Do
you believe, to this point, that Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice under his leadership has been aggressive enough in pursuing not just this case, but other instances of alleged overreach by the Justice Department under Trump?
Well, I would say Merrick Garland has shown independence, and that was the most important quality in having an Attorney General. What's concerning, though, is that we are seeing the Justice Department is defending Donald Trump in the defamation suit that E. Jean Carroll has in a sexual assault case against him. And the Justice Department is claiming that the president at the time was acting in his official capacity. I don't think anyone buys that a president who smears a sexual assault accuser is acting in his official capacity. So I don't think we need to have any appearance of even-handedness just for the sake of even-handedness. I think we need to go back to the department truly being independent and with no regard to any political party.
Big picture before we go. There's a remarkable confluence of things in what we've learned now. One, targeting Democratic lawmakers who the president, I don't have to tell you, specifically singled out for public comments and attacks, but also staff members, not just even involved in the Russia investigation, other things, but also family members. And as you have noted, a minor. I mean, this is Nixonian enemies list kind of stuff, weaponizing. In effect, do you believe the president was weaponizing the Justice Department here against his political enemies?
Absolutely, he weaponized the Justice Department. He did the same thing in the reason he was impeached the first time. He weaponized his foreign relations to have another country smear an ambassador and smear Joe Biden, the vice president at the time. This is just what he does, and it's so important that there are consequences for this because he is trying to come back. He thinks he's going to be back in August. And this president, next time, I promise you, if he's ever in power, will not be as patient. He is incompetent in many ways, but he has learned on the job. And I'm just afraid that a more corrupt president could do real damage and just destroy the rule of law in this country.
One brief question, because you have mentioned that a minor was targeted here. Do we know any information about who that minor was or how connected to the broader investigation?
I'll leave that to Chairman Schiff. I think he has a better grasp of all the details. I know I received a notice, but again, no minors should be targeted for a president's, quest to smear and clear political opponents.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thanks so much for walking us through it all.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jim.
We do have these live pictures. The meetings have begun now that the family photo has been taken among G7 leaders. Let's listen in.
Thank you all very much for coming. It is genuinely wonderful to see everybody in person. I can't tell you what a difference it makes. We've all been going through the most wretched pandemic our countries have faced for our lifetimes, maybe longer, much longer. And I actually think this is a meeting that genuinely needs to happen, because we need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the pandemic. We need to make sure that we don't repeat some of the errors that we doubtless made in the course of the last 18 months or so. And we need to make sure that we now allow our economies to recover. And I think that they have the potential to bounce back very strongly, and there's all sorts of reasons for being optimistic. But it is vital that we don't repeat the mistake of the last great crisis, the last great economic recession in 2008, when the recovery was not uniform across all parts of society. And I think what's gone wrong with this pandemic, or what risks being a lasting scar, is that I think that inequalities may be entrenched. And we need to make sure that as we recover, we level up across our societies and we build back better. And I actually think that we have a huge opportunity to do that, because as G7, we are united in our vision for a cleaner, greener world, a solution to the problems of climate change. And in those ideas, in those technologies, in which we're all addressing together, I think there is the potential to generate many, many millions of high-wage, high-skill jobs. And I think that is what the people of our countries now want us to focus on. They want us to be sure that we're beating the pandemic together and discussing how we'll never have a repeat of what we've seen, but also that we're building back better together, and building back greener, and building back fairer, and building back more equal, and how shall I, in a more gender neutral and perhaps a more feminine way. How about that, apart from anything else? So those are some of the objectives that we have before us at Carbis Bay. Thank you all very, very much. I'm now going to